Thank you to everyone joining us today from across the country and around the world. I'm Melissa Doolin-Koehne, Vice President of Business Development here at Conscious Capitalism, Inc. On behalf of the entire CCI team, we appreciate you taking the time to learn and grow in our community with us. Today, we are joined by Deepa Purushothaman, the author of The First, the Few, the Only, How Women of Color Can Redefine Power in Corporate America, which was just released last week. As many of you know, conscious capitalism is a philosophy that emphasizes the human nature of business, as well as a movement of business leaders from around the world who are working to change the practice and perception of capitalism as a means to elevate humanity. Conscious Capitalism, Inc. is a nonprofit organization dedicated to catalyzing the movement by creating learning opportunities like today's session and building systems of support for practicing conscious capitalists through our Senior Leader Network membership. Several times a month, we are offering these virtual gatherings as a way for our community to see how this philosophy takes shape in the leadership journeys and the business practices of those in our network. About today's gathering. Today we'll be running around 45 minutes. Deepa and I will be in conversation for about 30 of those. And then we'll transition to audience questions for the last 10 to 15 minutes of our session. So please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get as many of your questions as we can during our time together. If you have any technical questions or issues, please email us at info@consciouscapitalism.org. So now it is my pleasure to introduce you to today's speaker, Deepa Purushothaman. Deepa is a former senior executive, a corporate inclusion visionary, and co-founder of nFormation. Deepa is an author, speaker, and leader in practice at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she challenges and redefines the status quo of leadership, success, and power by centering the needs and experience of women in color and unveiling the inclusion biases in corporate structures. She's here with us today to talk about her new book and discuss how we can all redefine the power and create more inclusive workplaces. Deepa, we're so excited to have you in conversation today, especially what a perfect day to host you here at Conscious Capitalism. It's International Women's Day.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited. I think it's a perfect day to have this conversation.
It is the perfect day to have this conversation. And I know in your book, you interviewed over 500 women of color in this book. So I can't think of a better way to honor you and the voices of the women in your book than today. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I agree. I mean, I wrote the book for the women of color, right? So to have their voices and their stories highlighted on today especially just feels so important. So thank you for making space. And it also feels so aligned to the values and the things you talked about. Like so much of what you mentioned as an organization is also throughout the book. So really excited to be in conversation with you.
Yes, me too. So I was telling you is that I was following you on LinkedIn. You're so much fun to follow on LinkedIn, especially now that you just published your book last week. And I saw today is your Super Bowl day. And you said it feels different this year. International Women's Day feels different this year. Explain to me kind of why you think that.
Yeah, so I feel that way because I feel like we're having a different set of conversations. You know, part of what the book is about is the first, the few, the only, and this idea that trailblazers are someone we should uphold. But there's also a shadow side to trailblazing that we don't talk. It's really hard. And a lot of the women I interviewed feel really alone. And I think about that today, especially. So a lot of companies, a lot of places will do a program today or talk about, you know, their success stories. There are a few women leaders at the top. And although important, and I want to give them due credit, I think it's also a day where we should talk about why don't we have more? Why don't we have many? How do we move the many? And so today felt different because I'm getting calls today to talk about that in a very different way. It's not just you come be on a panel and talk about, you know, how amazing women are and how they're rising. We're actually talking about systemic issues, structural biases, and talking about things like racism and sexism in a very different way, at least than I've seen from years past. So I think there's more openness to there's work to be done, which I think has to be part of the conversation we have. So
I love that. I love that. And you wrote the book really for women of color. So what do you hope this book will mean for women of color?
yes, I shared with you, Melissa, I wrote the book for women of color, and yet to date, have been mostly conversations with allies, which is wonderful. It's been really unexpected in a good sort of way. So I think there's more appetite for this book than I ever realized. I wrote it because I wanted women of color to not feel alone. So many of the women that I interviewed, had risen, had gotten their seat, but they felt so alone and had to really navigate spaces and figure out things by themselves. And I almost wanted to create like a manual or a how-to or really like a roadmap how women of color could navigate. That's what I intended to do, so that they didn't feel so alone, in some ways like I did. What I found is a lot of allies and leaders and even company, HR leaders are reading the book in an attempt to really understand what the experience is like for women of color. And what I'm realizing is there's an appreciation that it's different, but I don't know that we've had space as women of color to really share how it's different, or it's even been really valued to share how it's different. It's hard to talk about, right, the challenges. It's hard to talk about what's wrong with the system because you're not always rewarded for that. But yet I feel like a lot of allies are picking up the book and saying, we want to understand, we want to do better, tell me what to do. That's what I get asked a lot. So I have to say, like, I'm excited by that because in order to change culture, we have to do it together. So I feel like there's more willingness to do that than ever before.
Yeah, and Deepa, it's so interesting. I got the book last week, right when you released it, and I'm having all these aha moments of experiencing that your experiences that you're sharing as a white woman, seeing this in corporate America unfold, and I love that you're sharing that experience as a woman of color because we can all learn and grow from it. So I love that, and I'm having those aha moments myself. So I really appreciate this book and the storytelling around it. So because you and I talked about that a lot, is storytelling and the power of storytelling. So tell us, how did you get to writing this book, representing women of color, and interviewing over 500 women through your research?
Yeah, and Melissa, I want to start with it because I think it's so important for people that are just tuning in and haven't seen the book yet. Although I wrote it for women of color, I think a lot of it applies to women. And candidly, I think a lot of it applies to everybody. I get the sense, and more people are reaching out to me, that we're in a moment where, as a result of the last few years, a lot of people are asking, like, how does work show up in our lives? How do we want work to be? It's not working for me either. So a lot of men of color are reaching out, and even white men who are saying, I want to be able to spend time with my children. I don't want work to take up all of this space. So I do think the themes are written for women of color because there's so few books written for us, but I do think it applies, just so everyone understands. A lot of it, I think, applies to everybody more now more than ever. As far as the storytelling, I interviewed 500 women of color because I felt like I wanted to make sure I understood what was happening. I didn't want to speak for women of color. I didn't want to just speak to a certain segment. And so it was important to me to get the variety and to kind of get a flavoring of what's happening to us if I was going to talk about us as a cohort. There are differences amongst women of color, so I want to say that, and I call that out in the book where I can. But what I found is that it was so important to hear their stories. And I went about this process not planned. So I didn't know I was going to write a book. I was really struggling with leaving my corporate job. I had had an amazing career, but in the last few years of my role, I started to get sick. I started to have bigger questions around purpose. I started to really be wondering if I was in the right place. And these growing questions around, like, what's my work in the world? So in an attempt to figure out what to do, I started meeting with women of color. And I did that because as a first, so I was the first Indian woman, partner in the role and all of those things, I felt really responsible, not only to the women of color coming after me, but I wondered if I left, would it be seen as my failure? And would it somehow, reflect on them? Would people think like we couldn't hack it? And I felt that weight very heavy, even though I couldn't fully articulate it. So I started meeting with women of color just to figure out, like, what does one do at a senior level? Like, how do you not feel responsible for those things? And so over the course of about a year, I met with 300 women of color, some one-on-one, and then eventually in these group settings, just dinners where I was casually having conversations. And those dinners turned out to be the most profound, life-changing conversations, Melissa, because what I found is we would get into the rooms, just chit-chatting, I thought networking. We'd end up there for 6 or 7 hours, just sharing stories of what it was like to navigate spaces on our own. And these were all senior women of color. Those stories, those conversations became fodder for the book and also fodder for the company that I created, because I realized so many of us felt the same way. We felt alone. We felt proud of what we had done, but we felt all these other things that there had never been space to talk about, like that responsibility, like representing our race, like talking about and maybe even forming in corporate culture. And so, yeah, the stories in the book come from really those dinner series, but came from this profound sense of we're all figuring it out on our own, and how do we do this differently? Because it doesn't need to be that way.
Yeah. And it looks like, you took this and you said we all are doing this alone, and you created something out of that. And we'll get to that because I
Yeah.
want to hear more about how you're doing this as a community now, which I really, really love. Let's back this up a little bit and really talk about your career and your personal experiences and what you experienced. And you talk about being the first, right, of a lot of different positions and experiences. Can you share a little bit about your own workplace experience?
Yeah, I was the first, like I said, and there weren't a lot of leaders that looked like me coming ahead of me. And so when I got into my company and got into my role, I looked around and didn't necessarily see leadership that looked like me and started to wonder, so does that mean I, don't belong? What does that mean for me? And I also realized that I didn't have to see it to be it. I actually wrote that, and I talk about it in the book, like I wrote that as a mantra and kept it for myself. And I also started to realize that I could pick and choose leadership styles from a lot of different leaders around me, that I didn't have to be one leader that I modeled myself around. And I think most of us think there's one leader that we're going to aspire to be, and that's how we model our career. And I couldn't do that because I didn't see myself fully represented in others. So I kind of always early on knew that I had to figure that out for myself. But I also think there was a lot of isolation, a lot of confusion, and a lot of like, how much of myself can I bring? Like, I never felt pressure from the company that I couldn't, but it was my own internal narrative on like, how much do I bring and what does that look like? And so that was really, I think, a conscious conversation for me in my head. And I think especially as a little brown girl growing up in New Jersey, I didn't always see myself represented. I didn't always see myself in television or in school or teachers and all those things. So I think unconsciously, I had a lot of questions about what can leadership look like? Can it look differently? For me, candidly, Melissa, the issues or the feedback I used to get was more age related. So I looked young, even though I was a senior partner, and less with my company and more with clients because I served a lot of clients. And so I always felt like I was having to prove my credentials, prove myself. Someone just wrote in the chat, imposter syndrome, and that was a real thing for me. I carried a lot of imposter syndrome, and part of what I talk about in the book is I think imposter syndrome is partly what we carry, but I think it also happens to us as a result of being in structures where we're not seen, and it's both of those things together. So part of what I'm trying to help women of color see is some of what you think is you, some of what I navigated as my own insecurities actually come from not seeing myself. And I had to kind of let those things go. So that's a little bit of my story. The big story is I started to get really towards the end of my career. It was kind of a combination of a growing question around purpose, and then some questions around, I really started to just get ill, and the symptoms kept growing and growing. It's actually one of the most surprising things I found in my research. So in interviewing these 500 women of color, 2 out of 3 of them are actually sick, and sick, what I call with a mysterious illness. So not like a cancer diagnosis or something that's clearly diagnosable. More of these, I think, stress related disorders. And I do think that comes from fitting in, from trying to, figure it out, from the sense of weight that we carry as a result of being a first. And so for me, it and ultimately made me, pick a different career, and made me really want to create community so more women of color could find health and safety. And for me, I think the big learning is that I used to think about success and health as 2 different things. Like success for me was like more metric driven, or
Right.
really about advancing. And now I have a new definition of success, that I don't think I can be successful if I'm not healthy. And that's like a very new learning. And it's a little bit different than what I think most people think about when you think about corporate America, because there is a lot of sacrificing your health and your family and your time to get ahead. And I think that's part of what I want to rewrite for us, for everybody, candidly.
Yeah, I love that part too. And that's something that I think so many women in the workplace can identify. You talking about why you left your job because you were sick, and how many women, you mentioned too, how many women have taken COVID-19 as this moment in their life where they've reconsidered the delusions that we've been given, right? And
Yeah.
what kind of life do I want to live? You mentioned in your book something around like shedding the skin and the delusion finding happiness in work and life. And what advice do you give to women that are trying to start the shedding and gain clarity around that?
Yeah, so one of the things I talk about, and I have a whole chapter about it in the book, is this idea of shedding and caring, that there are a lot of things that we're taught about what we should believe, right? And some of those things are things we're taught about work in corporate America, and I lay out 10 of those in the first chapter. But some of those things are also things we've been taught by our family, like about how to work and what we believe about ourselves. And for a lot of the women of color I met, there were a few messages. So one was that we had to work harder than everybody else just to get a fair shot, right? And I heard that almost consistently, especially amongst the Black women I interviewed. Another one was like to not rock the boat, that attention was a bad thing. And I heard that a lot amongst the Latino women that I interviewed. And so there's these ideas and these impressions. And another thing that I heard quite consistently was that a lot of the women of color I interviewed felt they weren't enough as a result of, not necessarily being, seen as leaders, or being told they could be leaders, or seeing themselves on television, in the media, and all of these things. And so those are messages I feel like we have to shed. We have to shed messages that don't serve us, is kind of what I talk about in the book. And we need to replace those messages with ones that do. So I do an exercise sometimes when I speak in person to groups, and I say, like, when I say a leader, or when I talk about a pilot, or when I talk about a professor, or when I talk about a politician, what do you think about? And almost inevitably, everyone in the room thinks of a white man, of like 5'10" in a power suit or something, maybe a sweater if he's a professor. But what do you and I think of? Like, I also think of that, those things. Like, it's usually a man, piloting a plane and all, and so we need to rewrite those narratives for ourselves. I think we need to shed those messages. And so that's really what I think a lot of the work is about. I talk about the power of me and the power of we. And the power of me is really getting clear on what you believe and what your boundaries are, and how you redefine for yourself what is possible. And that is a lot of shedding the delusions that don't serve us. And then you finally can get to the power of me, which is like you and I coming together in community, me finding other women of color, so I'm now not navigating by myself. But it all starts with like really getting clear for yourself, like, what do I believe, or what have I been taught about this, success, about leadership, about life, that really isn't working for me? And for me, it came when I got sick. When I got sick, I realized that so much of what I've been taught was to work hard and to really put all in, because my parents were immigrants to this country. They gave up so much to come here. But I was giving up so much that I was sacrificing my health. And that's also not a way to live. But I never had that conversation in my family, right? And so that was a narrative that I had to rewrite for myself.
Yeah, and how did you do that? Because you know what, Deepa, I love that you're having this conversation. I think this is something that I am seeing so much of now, and I'm so glad that you addressed it, is that we are literally making ourselves sick
Yeah.
with these preconceived notions of what success looks like. And so how did you define success? How did you get to this point where you just said, enough is enough? I'm going to do it my way.
Yeah, I mean, mine came literally, I ended up spending 8 months in bed and getting that sick. So for me, it was kind of a crisis point. I tell a story in the book where I met my 14th doctor before I got my final diagnosis. And she's someone I saw when I traveled. So I'll set up the story because I think it's so important. So I've gone to see her in San Diego. I walk into her office with my rolly board, and she's now giving me my feedback. I've seen her 3 times. We've run hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tests because we agree something is wrong with me, but we can't figure out what it is. And I can see her side-eye looking at my suitcase in the corner, right? Like judging me that I've come to a doctor's appointment with my suitcase. And she says to me, like, we can keep running tests or tell you what you already know. Your job is killing you. And not that the literal job was killing me, but she basically went on to say, you're traveling, you out of a suitcase, you don't eat properly, you don't sleep, what kind of stress is that putting on your body? And then she asked me 3 profound questions. She said, what would you do if you didn't do a big job like this? Do you feel like you have to do a job like this? And do you see yourself as worthy just being you? And I have to tell you, like, that was a shocking set of questions to be asked because they were so real. And I'm not sure that I did, right? I'm not sure that I felt like I was worthy if I didn't have, if I didn't have things to prove. And I was very performance and productivity oriented. And so I had to rewrite a lot of those messages. And a lot of the women of color that I interviewed were these women who had finally found their voice, but they found their voice after some sort of crisis. So a divorce, or they didn't get a promotion, or some sort of racist incident happened, and they had to really reevaluate. I call it almost like the system not working for them. And it causes them to question, like, is how I'm performing or how I'm operating going to get me what I want? Maybe it isn't, so I have to stop. And these women, and just like myself, they took profound looks at their lives, right? And so for me, it was journaling. For me, it was writing. I started working with a lot of alternative healers to do a lot of inner work on, what was important to me and what kind of life did I want, and to really ask questions about, were things I was striving for truly going to make me happy? And that's not easy, but it takes, and takes usually that sort of crisis point. But I want more of us to do it not in crisis. And what I found is, I think more than ever, a lot of us are doing it because of the last few years and COVID, and really asking, if we were ever going to change our lives, maybe this is the moment, and what do we want to change it to become? So I do think we're in a moment where a lot of people are asking those questions. I just happened to ask it 2 years ago at the early onset of COVID, when I think a lot of people were.
I love that, Deepa. And I think, that's another piece of this, of what you were talking about, why this year might feel a little bit different too, right? Is that I think that we're all internally asking our questions around that. And what does that define? And I'm so glad that you are giving that voice to women of color, because it's just not been a voice that's been really, really heard so much. And so we have been talking a lot about women of color, but the truth is, a lot of what you're sharing right now is relevant across the full spectrum of unrepresented groups. And what commonalities are you seeing through your research?
Yeah, I mean, I think the experience for women of color is very, in a lot of ways, very similar. There's not the intersection of sexism and racism. And I think for women, a lot of what I share is also very common. A lot of moms are struggling with all the things we're bringing up. So I do see similarities. I think the difference is, when I talk to the men of color, they're not struggling with maybe some of the sexual harassment or some of the other aspects that come with, navigating spaces as a woman or a woman of color. I also think a lot of the women of color shared, and especially the immigrant women, that they actually struggled with men from their countries, their original home countries, more than even white men in the workplace. So for example, I'll talk about being Indian, of Indian descent. A lot of the Indian women I spoke to said that they found the Indian men were the most difficult for them to work with because of cultural biases or expectations, or these Indian women found it difficult to speak up or to push back or get feedback from who worked with Indian men. So I think part of what we also have to understand is some of our cultural baggage or cultural background, some of the patriarchy that comes from our cultures, also ends up playing itself out in the workplace, and we need to talk about that. That's what I found is different, but I think some of the other challenges are similar. Like a lot of the Black men I spoke with really struggle with how are you assertive and not seen as angry, which is the same thing I heard a lot of the Black women I spoke with, kind of struggling with that fine line of not really knowing what to do. And I think so many of us, I mean, the bigger conversation is, I think a lot of us are struggling with what I call this Goldilocks phenomenon of we know that there's some path we're supposed to walk. It doesn't feel exactly right for us because it wasn't made for us or by us, but we're also not sure what constitutes going off of that path. And so it's a little bit of a struggle, which is why I think more of us need to tell our stories. Because I think real power for all of us, all groups that don't have full voice, is finding ways that we can be true to who we are and where we come from. And there's so many strengths that we have as women of color and people of color, but those things aren't always valued in the workplace. And that feels like a real disconnect. And in this moment, we can find ways to talk about that and bring those strengths to the workplace. That's really where innovation and possibility, in my mind, comes from for the next few decades.
Yeah, and that's so interesting, hearing that, because I think you're spot on when you're talking about the different cultural differences and how that shows up in the workplace, and honoring that and seeing that, and then how do you become an ally when you do see that. So, what is the best way to respond in moments of microaggressions? And can you give an example of some of those times where you experience that?
Yeah, the interesting thing is, I think one of the big things we can do is people of color, women of color, and then even as allies, is be prepared. And I don't think we talk about that enough. So again, I'll speak from my own history. We didn't talk about racism growing up. Like, we didn't even talk about race in my household. There was this belief, again, as a child of immigrants, like if you just work hard, it'll work itself out. And so when systems show up differently, I didn't really understand what that was originally. And I had ended up having to do a lot of my own work to understand, again, what was mine and what was not. And so in instances of microaggressions or racism, I think most of us are caught flat-footed. If you're the one that it's being done to, I remember being shocked or awed, or just not even sure what to say. And I think as allies, there's a real struggle right now, Melissa. I'm like, do I help? I don't want to be seen as like, saving or jumping in when I shouldn't. So it's a real struggle. So what I'm asking everyone to do is to practice and to be prepared and to be really honest with yourselves that it's highly probable all of us are going to end up in situations where a microaggression happens or racism happens or we're witness to it. So as women of color and people of color, I want us to have 3 statements at the ready. So to have things ready, that literally to practice, because it's one thing to know you should say them. In the moment, it can be really hard to say them. So things like, what you just said really hurts me, or can we pause the meeting because we need to talk about what was just said, or we're going to have to come back to what was just said because it actually was not appropriate. Whatever that is for you. And I'm just giving you 3 examples off the top of my head. And I really encourage the women of color that I work with to practice those things, because otherwise, in the emotion of the situation, you can sometimes not know what to do and don't feel like you protect yourself. But the more important thing, or equally important thing, is I want allies to practice that too. So Melissa, if you see something, I want you to be able to say, can we pause? I just want to check in with the team. We might need to talk about that after the meeting. Or, Deepa, I'm seeing something on your face. Should we talk about that? It can be whatever feels comfortable to you, but I also want you to practice knowing that you will probably witness something that doesn't feel good. And if it doesn't feel good for you, I guarantee it probably doesn't feel good for me, but we just don't practice. I think we've all been taught that it'll be okay, or, somehow there's shame involved in like calling somebody out. But I think there's different ways of calling people out, that it doesn't have to be aggressive or assertive. It can just be kind of recognizing in the moment that something doesn't feel right. And so to me, it's a lot of this work is about practice, is about permission, like giving ourselves permission to try. We might not get it right the first time, and a little bit of patience, right? Like we're all learning. And I think that's the biggest part of this. Even the women of color I interviewed, even myself, like I'm still learning. Our vocabulary has changed so much in the last couple of years. So I think it's just a really an important moment where we can have conversations about race. We can do this differently, but we all have to practice and be aware of it.
I love how you wrote in the book too, is like the George Floyd incident 2 years ago, and what happened there just really rocked everybody. And no one talked about racism in the workplace really. And then all of a sudden this happens, and there's all these conversations happening around racism and microaggressions, and people are learning as you go of how to have the conversations in the workplace. So when you mentioned that, that was such an aha moment for me, of like, we all are learning in this together, right? Is that these were, very, very quiet conversations, and they weren't really talked about as a company or from leadership. So what advice would you give to leaders and companies as they navigate this, of how can they be a better ally in the conversation and make it comfortable to have those conversations in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, there's 2 things that come up for me. One is I think we're still struggling with a lot of performative measures, right? Where companies are doing things, but it's not really having an impact.
Right.
I'll tell you a story. Like the story I told in the book is, after George Floyd's murder, I got calls from a number of CEOs who were trying to put letters out and wanted my eyes on the letters to see if there was anything else to add. And then I'd go and edit the letters, and then the CEOs, and most of them were white men, would call me afterwards and say, well, that's too much. I'm not prepared to be that provocative, or can you tone it down? And I was like, well, why are you doing this? Like it is going to require you to get out of your comfort zone. So a lot of what I tell individual leaders is you have to give yourselves permission to get it wrong before you get it right. And it's going to take some missteps, and you're going to have to learn that, because we're all learning. That at the same time, what I tell companies is, I think there's a belief, and this also happened after George Floyd's murder, where we were meeting with employees and we were having soundings. And so, there was this feeling of we're hearing from our employees. And I can't tell you how many companies I've gone into, and I've met with the CEO, and she has said, mostly he has said to me, my employees tell me how it is. My Black employees will sit down with me and tell me what's wrong. And I'll go and meet those same employees 2 hours later, and they've told me a whole different set of stories, a different experience. So I think there's still a gap between what we believe we're being told and what's truly happening, because it's not always safe to talk about what's wrong, about microaggressions, about racism, about all of the things that happen in the workplace. And so part of what we have to recognize and what we have to do is to find a different way to hold space to have those conversations, and maybe an awakening that it's possible, it's highly likely, I should say, that racism is happening in your workplace. It may not be happening everywhere, but it's okay to admit that. It's okay to admit that we don't have a meritocracy, that the system shows up differently for different people. Because if we don't have that conversation, we can't change it. And some of the companies that I go into and speak to will say, well, this is a great conversation, but that doesn't happen here. And I think we all need to get more comfortable with, I want to believe that it's very rare, if any, companies where it's not happening at all. And we just have to be more aware of it and be more open to it, because we can't change it if we don't talk about it.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's so spot on in so many ways. So I know we're reaching at the halfway point. So I do want to open it up to anybody that is listening in that might have some questions. Feel free to put it in the Q&A section, and we'll make sure that we get it to it and make sure that Deepa has time to answer those. I think it's really interesting when you were talking about the leadership aspect of this, and how do we begin to overcome our own limited image of what leadership looks like? How do we own that and continue to grow there?
I think we very narrowly define leadership, and we define it as what's come before, and that's part of the challenge, right? So a leader looks like that pilot, looks like that white male CEO that I keep talking about. And I think part of what we have to also recognize is that our definition of leadership and what we think is important has changed significantly. So I talk about things like empathy and trusting your intuition and your gut, and these other qualities that I think a lot of people have, especially women have, but we haven't always prioritized that in the workplace. We always prioritize the rational and the brain over all the other emotions and ways we can lead. But I think the last few years have shown us that we're in a moment where we need to open up that definition. We need to think about leadership differently, not only in what it represents, but the things that we value. And so I tell a story in the book where I sat down with Stacey Brown Philpott, and she used to be the CEO of TaskRabbit. She's a Black woman who sits on multiple boards. And she was talking to me about how her family had just gotten a puppy like the week before I interviewed her. And the puppy Fifi, she said, follows her around. And she was kind of laughing as she told me. She said, of all the people in our family, I believe she has a 4-person family, she's the least puppy, excited, or she was the last one that wanted the puppy. She feels like the puppy follows her around because she's clear and she's a very assertive leader, but she's also safe and secure. And that part of what leadership looks like for her in her mind now is creating psychological safety, is actually creating safe space for other employees. Right. And we had this real big conversation about how the puppy analogy was like really interesting. And so I think we're in a moment where we want different things from our leaders. We don't just want the leaders of the past. Like, I do think our definition of leadership is changing, but I think we also have to change it for ourselves. And we're in a moment where I think culture and companies and, revenues and all the things that drive companies are also really starting to open up, because we need more voices and we need to see it differently. But it also takes, us redefining it for ourselves too.
That puppy analogy is so smart about how to create that space, because that is such okay, I get this. How do we make a safe place to have these conversations and to feel safe in your workplace? I love that. So we have quite a few questions coming in, Deepa, and we'll start getting through them. Kim Flick asks, what are some of the best ways we can help combat ageism? Too young, too old stereotypes in the intersectionality of their implicit biases.
I think this is a real issue. And I would tell you, I think it's probably more profound than we understand, because I don't think there's been enough space to talk about how ageism is showing up, in the workplace. I will tell you my own story, and I tell it very briefly in the book. But I ended up having a new client. I was a brand new partner, new client. And I was told this client is, very challenging and difficult, doesn't love consultants at all. And I set up a meeting with him. And I remember walking into his office, and I got maybe 2 steps into the office where he kind of looked, at me from, pulled his glasses down and looked at me and kind of said something along the lines of, if I had a daughter, she would be older than you. Like, what could you possibly have to tell me? And I remember in that moment feeling shocked, because here I am with my partner title, here I am coming to advise him. And in that moment, I felt cut at the knees. And out of nowhere, I took a beat, I took a breath, and I said to him, if I don't tell you something in 20 minutes that you don't know, I'll give you the rest rest of your hour back and I'll never ask for time again. We ended up spending 2 hours together, right? And he became one of my best clients because I had a lot to tell him that no one else wanted to tell him. But I also feel like similarly, like that answer that I got out of nowhere that just came out of my body, and I said to him, give me the 20 minutes, are things we need to practice. So along the same lines, Kim, I think we just need to find ways, I don't know, it's to combat it, but to be prepared when it comes up. And I think we need to have more conversations about how ageism is showing up, especially for women. I think it's a real thing. There's a lot of studies that do show as women get older, you know, as opposed to men who actually have more authority and more credibility, like for women, it actually goes down. And I think it's a conversation we need to have more of.
I love that. So we have several people asking, can you repeat the 3 questions your doctor asked you?
Yes, and they may be slightly worded differently in my book because that is what I sat and thought about what she said. But they were about around these 3 lines. So one was, do you have to do a big job like this to feel worthy? 2, what else would you do if you didn't do this job? And 3, do you see yourself as worthy just being you? And what she was saying is you have to have a job with a big title to be worthy. So those were the 3 questions. It was very much about this idea that you can just be in the world and that you are valuable just being. It's not what you produce or your purpose or what you do. It's actually who you are. And that is I've worked with a lot of spiritual teachers. That's like a very spiritual, very clear, you know, teaching, but we don't always bring it to the workplace, right? And then maybe we have to find a better way to do that.
That gives me chills just thinking about that, because I think so many women can picture themselves sitting in that doctor's office and the doctor saying the exact same thing to them. So we all have to support each other in that. I know that I'm guilty of that as well. So this is a good reminder for myself. So Caleb Rayburn said, have you interviewed any women of color leading unionized organizations such as schools that serve marginalized communities where standing up for what's right runs the consequence of retaliation?
Yeah, I did. I would say retaliation, I have a whole chapter about it in the book, is real. And so what I talk about quite a bit is just being prepared that more often than not, there is retaliation. Was surprising to me more than the unionization or it happening in schools is that it actually came up for the more senior women. So I was under the impression, as were most of these women, that once you got to the top, you could do it your way, right? That maybe you conformed and contorted yourself, but once you were in a seat of power, you could actually be in full voice and you could speak up about racism. You could do what you needed to do. And so many of the women that I interviewed actually said it was the opposite. Once they got to the seat of power, there was less ability to be themselves. And there was less ability to talk about and report racism. So when some of the women I interviewed, and I interviewed about a dozen very senior women who ended up filing complaints or talking about what happened to them, they ended up getting pushed out because of retaliation. So a lot of what I talk about in the book is understanding that process, having your lawyers lined up and all of the other things that happen, because although companies are saying that they want to talk about racism, I don't think that our processes and our HR departments have all been caught up to really actually handle racism when it's reported. So I do think it's a real issue and something we need to talk about more. And I do talk about that a little bit more in the book.
That's great. So another person asked, as a woman of color, others are often bringing up conversations around kids and family, like when are you starting a family and do you have plans of starting a family, which is a pretty sensitive topic in the workplace, and back to the ageism concept. How do you navigate that in the workplace?
I think it's similar, like have your statements prepared. So if you know it's happened once or twice, it's probably going to happen again. I used to get those same sorts of questions. I was single for most of my career. I only got married towards the tail end of my career. And so I used to get a lot of questions, more so along, and it was mostly from Indian gentlemen. So people from my own culture saying, how do your parents feel about you not being married? Or aren't you worried that you're never going to get married? And I grew up in a household, just to kind of set the stage, where arranged marriage was something my parents talked about. It was never in my frame of reference, but that's what they thought, would be appropriate when the time was right. We had a lot of battles about that. And so I remember always being kind of like looking at them sideways when people would say that to me, like, why are they asking me that question? And are they asking other women that? So I would have answers prepared. But I also think a lot of inappropriate things are asked of all women in the workplace, right? And I think it's a real issue, and I think it's okay. I think we're in a moment where we can say, like, I'm not sure that you understand how that question feels for me. Or what if I asked you a similar question, and we need to brainstorm about what that question could be. But I think we have to find ways that actually allow us to push back on things that are just not things we should be asked anymore. And we don't have to keep taking that. That's what I would say. But
Yeah.
I get it. I understood. I've been there. And I think now I would just I would just literally stop the conversation in a way that I probably back then, I felt like, what did I do to open the space up for that conversation? And I know that's really about them. That's not about me. But I learned that now. I don't know that I knew that 10 years ago.
Yes, I see this happening so much, and you're right. Just the idea of what conversations we're having 10, 20, 30 years ago in the workplace versus now, there's so much openness to it. I'm curious too, was there differences in the respondents depending on the age of who responded and how optimistic or they were around the change that they're seeing?
Yeah, I did find some differences, but I also think that there could be some data that actually unpacks that a little bit. So in general, what I found is I call them less tenured women. So women that are younger than me, less tenured women, had a different belief. I think a lot of them went in eyes open, feeling like the corporate system for women of color is egregious, is not fair, is all of those things. But they also went in only wanting to get 1 or 2 years of experience. So Melissa, this is what's fundamentally different. I think a lot of the women that were less tenured that I spoke with basically said, I'm going in with an extract mentality. I'm going to spend a year or two, and then I'm going to go start my own business. I'm just finding the skills from these big companies. That feels different. But I also have found some of the middle tenured women thought they wouldn't face these things, and then they do. So I think it's a little bit of both, where I think when we're less tenured, I mean, I did myself, we want to believe it's going to be different. And I do think it's getting better, but I don't think it's completely gone. But I also think we're in a moment where women of color are just more honest, and they're not going to stay in places where it doesn't work for them. And they're just going in knowing it's going to be a little bit more biased. And books like mine show you exactly how biased it can be, and allow us to have that conversation in a really different way.
Now, you mentioned a lot of people were talking about, a lot of these women of color were talking about starting their own businesses because they just didn't want to do it the way that it has been or how things have been set up. What can corporate America do to make sure that they're providing a place of safety and inclusivity?
I think we have to have a better conversations around what it means to listen, what it means to hold safe space. I think we need to change our HR processes, and obviously so retaliation and all these other topics that have come up today don't happen. And I also think we need to understand and start to make space for the fact that I think women and women of color, and other groups too, but I work as women and women of color, we lead differently. And so let us lead in our full voice. Don't ask us to be like the examples that came before us, because we can even do more. We can be better than that. We can lead in ways that actually reflect our culture and our history and our knowledge and our gut, sense. But those things have usually been pushed aside. So it's a little bit of make space, get out of the way, and allow us to use all of our, what I call superpowers, right? Let us use all of our superpowers, because I think it will not only benefit the company and our allies, but it's also going to help us show up in ways that people haven't even seen yet. I think there's so much power we have as women and women of color, but we kind of have been in this situation where it all kind of gets cut away from us, or we get really compartmentalized, or we end up being in situations where we feel smaller. And I'm asking us to unleash our power and kind of give us space to do us, because I think it's only going to help everybody.
I love that so much. And I love the idea of embracing just your own unique, but what your uniqueness, your true person, and bringing that to work, and how that can be a superpower. That brings me to a question from someone, Michelle Risa, who says, I hear that women will be taking over the world. I think Beyonce wrote a story or a song about that. She said, I actually don't. What are your thoughts on that?
I actually don't. She doesn't think they're going to be taking over the world.
Yes.
I'm not out here advocating taking over the world and, just turning the tables, because I don't think that actually helps anybody. Like, the conversation I want to have is how we do power differently, how we look at concepts like scarcity differently, because I don't think they help any of us, and how we actually change, the static idea that the table has 12 seats around it. And if we just kind of got rid of all the men and put the women, it would be a better place. That's not at all what I'm saying. I think there's more fundamental questions about what it means to be in a capitalist structure, what it means to actually make money, what it means to work, that I think those are the conversations that I want more space for, whether those are men or women or non-conforming, like it doesn't matter. But I think we need more space to have conversations about what we need and the vision and how we want what we want work to look like in the future. I really think that's the conversation. And I'll leave the debate on how many seats and who sits in those seats up to other people. But I do think we need more room so that there are more voices at the table. And that's really what this work is about.
More diversity. So last question for you, Deepa. I think we could talk for a long time, but I know you have probably 20 other events that you're going to today, which I'm so excited that you're getting the message out. So knowing that there are many conscious capitalists on this call today, what can we do as a community to support women of color and further advance those that have been and are being marginalized today?
I think it's really important to understand what our experience is like. So whether that's through books like mine, whether that's reading other things, whether that's, watching, it's really trying to understand what our experience is like and letting go of this idea that workplaces or institutions or structures show up the same for all of us. So that's the first part. I think the second thing is having conversations with people in a really genuine sort of way. And I know that's hard over Zoom, but I also think we're starting to do a little bit more in person. This is really about connecting and understanding what it's like to walk in other people's shoes. And, if we don't do that at work, where we spend the majority of our time, and it's actually one of the only places, and the research shows this, where we actually meet people who are different from us, when are we ever going to understand what it's like to walk in other people's shoes? So my advice is really to kind of learn, educate yourself, but then also to make an attempt to get to know people who might feel different than you, because we have more in common than we don't. And just give yourself permission to have conversations that you probably haven't had before, because that's the start of a very big shift that we all need. And I think shifting conversations on race will help shift conversations around capitalism and what's important to us and how we value things. And all of this is really a values conversation that I think we're having as a society.
Deepa, I can't thank you enough. One last thing, where can people find your book, The First, the Few, the Only, How Women of Color Can Redefine Power in Corporate America?
Yeah, so if you go to my website, Deepa Puru, so DeepaPuru.com, we have a whole bunch of different options for how you can buy the book, and also hear and see more of where I'm speaking and what comes next for information and for some of the work that I'm doing myself.
I highly encourage you to connect with Deepa on LinkedIn. She's a joy to follow. Thank you all so much for joining us today. If you could please take a 30 seconds to fill out the survey that's in the chat section. And if you're new to conscious capitalism, please visit consciouscapitalism.org for more information. And if you're currently implementing conscious practices in your business, we invite you to explore our growing support of like-valued leaders with our Conscious Capitalism Senior Leader Network. And you can join us on the Conscious Capitalism website as well. We hope to see you on our next virtual gathering, March 23rd, where we're talking about fortifying the frontline solutions for supporting essential workers. Thank you so much, Deepa. Really excited to read your book, and thank you so much for being a part of our community today, and happy International Women's Day.
Thank you, you too.